Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
A new proposal to fight the impacts of climate change will require the buy-in of developers. Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, how the city hopes to guide growth away from water hazards by offering incentives rather than penalties to home builders. Later, we ask saxophonist and host of the WJCT program Bop City, Daniel Stark, what his must-see list contains at this weekend's Jazz Fest. But first, despite the threats of rising seas and more intense storms, a surprising number of homes continue to be built in flood-prone areas. Here to tell us about a new effort to change that, we're joined by the city's Planning Department Director, Helena Parola. Helena, thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
I'm very glad to have you. So start, if you can, by telling us, what is the problem that you're trying to solve?
We looked at three different areas that the city is having issue with. One is that flood risk was increasing. We saw that with Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Matthew, with the floods that we regularly see in Springfield and San Marco and across the city. So that's one thing that we wanted to address is our increasing flood risk. Another that I'm sure everyone has heard is that our population is increasing. And with that population increasing, we need more housing. So we wanted to look at how to provide more housing in appropriate areas. Another area that we wanted to look at is while we need more housing, our housing is becoming more and more unaffordable. So we wanted to look at ways to provide more affordable housing. So all of those three components together, we looked at with a committee appointed by Mayor Deacon to see how the land development regulations and code requirements could be tweaked or changed to help resilience in those areas for flood, for housing, and for affordable housing.
And we'll talk about all of those elements, but in terms of specifically the flood risk, we've talked on this program before with the resiliency director with the city of Jacksonville, Ann Colonese, and within the next 30-year period, is my understanding, at least nationwide, if not specific to the city, 25% of all homes at risk of flooding in the next 30 years. Your own report indicates that currently there's about 6% of city homes that are at high risk of flooding, but that number, I believe you say, could triple by the year 2070. And so, very close to that, almost a quarter, essentially, of the home stock, a fifth or a quarter.
Yes. So what we did with this target growth area is through the Office of Resilience, we first started with all of the high-risk areas of flooding. They provided a highly detailed compound flood model research that they did, and we could identify all the areas in Duval County that are at high risk of flooding. And this includes storm surges, riverine, ocean, all of the different type of flooding that could happen in the area. So it's a highly detailed, we're very lucky to have it in Duval County, led by the Office of Resilience. So we used where the areas are at highest risk of flooding, and we took the inverse. So the inverse of the high risk would be the low risk. And those are the first areas that we looked at for places to guide growth, to guide that increase in housing, and to look at resilient efforts, so where it is appropriate to build.
And so that is a priority, the flooding component, but you have created a map that essentially lays out where you're going to try to steer this growth. And for people who are watching our live stream, we have a map of that up. The area in purple is the area that growth would essentially be guided towards. And it's not just flooding that drives that. So tell us what the other elements are that create these purple zones on this map.
Yes, there's purple and yellow zones, and those stand for the urban priority area and the urban area. And those are development areas that are outlined currently in our comprehensive plan. But let me get to exactly what that boundary is for the target growth area. So first, we have the low flood risk areas that I just talked about. So we start with a map with all the areas that are of the lowest flood risk. Then we clip that to only include the low flood risk that are in the urban priority and urban development areas. The urban priority and urban development areas are areas outlined in our comprehensive plan. They're areas that we want to revitalize. We want infill. They have access to transit, or they can accommodate transit opportunities. And they're where we want to see more density and more development. And you can tell that because it starts at like the city core and goes out from urban priority, urban, suburban is less density, rural is the least density. So low flood risk areas, the urban priority areas. And then we went further. We worked with JTA to find those high bus transit routes. So any planned and any currently that have the highest ridership, including the Emerald Trail that's planned. We took about a half-mile walk shed from those boundaries.
A walk shed.
A walk shed, so people can walk to those areas. So we're already in areas that can be built because it's low flood risk. You could walk to transit, and you're in the urban and urban priority area where we want to see that growth. You also have all city services and infrastructure, including water and sewer.
Right.
So you're filled with areas that would be easy to develop. So that's where we want to guide the development. Another thing that we did when looking at the community at large, we made sure that we protected the character of our existing single-family neighborhoods. So this boundary does not include anything in low-density residential areas, which are most of your single-family neighborhoods. It does not include anything in that, what we call the LDR land use categories. It also does not include anything that's in the zoning overlay. So when you look at the map, you can tell that like Riverside Avondale is cut out, or some of our other zoning overlays. There's a little piece of San Marco that's cut out.
Because those are areas, just for people who aren't familiar with what an overlay is, that's an area that a neighborhood or a community has advocated for and created certain additional zoning restrictions.
Correct. They've basically already done their own studies. They've already projected how they want to see that specific area grow. And that has already, that's part of our zoning code now and how they grow and move forward. So those areas are not included in this target growth area.
So those are the areas that the city has designated and is prioritizing. That's where you'd like to see some of this more dense growth go. How do you incentivize this? Because that really is the angle that the city is taking, is how do we encourage development in these areas as opposed to prohibiting development in other areas? And we'll talk about why that's not on the table, but tell us what the incentives are.
Okay, so in this target growth area, we've provided, or we will provide as it passes through council, and this does have to go to the state for review as well, but we will provide an incentive program. So if you have a piece of property located within these boundaries and you want to develop, what you have the opportunity to do is you can opt into this incentive program, which would allow for an increase in density. So right now, let's say your property is allowed 20 units per acre. You could opt into this incentive program and you'd be allowed 50% more than that. So you'd be allowed 30 units per acre. If you took advantage of that density, there's also some other advantages in the zoning code with flexibility as far as parking requirements, lot coverage, height flexibility. If you take advantage of all that, what the city wants to see in return, or is required to see in return if you take advantage of this, is one of two things. You would need to either develop in accordance with the resilient design factors, so you'd have to meet 3 of 5 design factors that will be spelled out in the zoning code when we get to that part, or you have to provide affordable housing. And the affordable housing, what we have is at 20% of 100% AMI would have to be provided for the project over a 30-year period.
Explain to us what AMI is, what that means.
It's area median income, and it's just a level of workforce housing depending on your salary. It's sometimes depending on a single person or based on a 4-person family.
But this is basically you'd have to make that wage or less in order to qualify?
For 20% of the units that the developer is building, they would have to agree to have them at a rent level that is 100% AMI or below.
Okay. And so, as you say, if they take advantage of this, they would be able to have some flexibility in density, height, lot coverage, parking requirements, which can be burdensome sometimes. those are limitations that have been developed also within certain community expectations and city design, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's a taller building or the need for a certain amount of parking on site. And so explain how that becomes negotiable, how that becomes something the city says, well, it's okay if we kind of make an allowance
Mhm.
on that front in order to get these other priorities.
Well, we definitely feel like the other priorities are worth the flexibility in that area, in those areas of the zoning code. Also, keep in mind that this will not affect low density residential. It won't affect housing. So you're not going to see a big tall building next to a single family house or a low story building. There are some height restrictions and some gradation
Hmm.
requirements as they move in. Um, they are next to transit, so there is that opportunity to connect the higher density with the transit option, so parking is not necessarily needed as much. And these are areas already designated in our comp plan where we want to revitalize, we want to infill, and we want to see an increase in density. So we don't feel like these incentives, the flexibility component, will overall negatively affect anything because of their location.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to Planning Department Director Helena Parola about some changes that are being proposed to drive growth in certain areas and perhaps limited in other areas if developers take advantage of these incentives. If you have a question or a comment, you can join our conversation on air by calling 904-549-2937. You can also go to firstcoastconnect.org to find all the ways to connect with us. We have a call from Yassine in St. Johns County. Good morning. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on. Um, More of a comment, really. So I live in St. Johns County, specifically in St. Johns. I live in the community of Rivertown. And one of the chronic issues that we have is we have plenty of housing, lots of development going on in the area. However, less of commercial development in terms of eateries, restaurants, other types of shopping. We have a lot of banks coming up. We have like auto shops. We got Sherwin-Williams, those kinds of things. But in order to get to a good restaurant, it takes about 15 to 20 minutes. And I feel there's a lot more housing being developed in the area, but not as much as commercial development. And I don't know if that's the same case in Duval County, but I think that's something that definitely needs to be looked into.
Thanks, Yassine. It does seem that Duval has a different set of problems. There is more housing being built here, but St. Johns County in many ways is almost a bedroom community for a lot of people commute to Jacksonville
Mhm.
to work, and the commercial properties are a little denser as you move in.
Right. I know that we've had some of those questions as we've been out in the community and kind of explaining this proposal that we have. And some of the concerns have been, that's great for housing, that's great for low flood risk, but we want to see some commercial development. This particular legislation that we're pushing forward is for housing and for affordable housing. However, generally, just planning design, as you bring more rooftops in, the commercial will come. And we are in Jacksonville, we're looking at those urban and urban priorities. So it is all infill development, it's not the outskirts suburban area. And those are some of the areas that are struggling with commercial development. And that's what we're hoping that the increase in housing, the market will bring in the commercial development with it.
We've got a message from Jim in Riverside. He says, I support this, but I see some mixed messages telling others not to build in flood zones, but doing it themselves. The city, through the Downtown Investment Authority, is preparing to spend $12 million to build a restaurant in Riverfront Plaza, where the landing used to be. Anyone who was here during Hurricane Irma will recall that area was under 3 feet of water. The waves were strong enough to lift the floating dock and drop it onto the shore. Um, and so basically, why doesn't the city follow its own advice?
I'm sure that in that instance, they work with I don't work with the Downtown Investment Authority, but I do know that they work closely with the Office of Resilience, and they have to follow the same requirements that anybody else in the city does as far as the floodplain management ordinance, and as far as building in any flood zones or any wetlands.
It's probably a good time to talk about what the city can and can't do when it comes to, for instance, denying a project or approving a project. There are guidelines that the city has in place in its comprehensive plan, and those are zoning and land use restrictions that limit certain kinds of development. But beyond those existing maps, what flexibility does the city have to tell a developer, if you're building within these existing map requirements and designations, you can't do something?
There are current regulations in place. So you've got the floodplain management ordinance that looks at all of our flood zones, and if you're developing, you are required to follow those regulations. There's also, if you're building on wetlands, you would have to get mitigation through the St. Johns River Water Management District. Most developers would rather opt out of having to mitigate for their wetlands, so they'll develop outside of those wetlands. They'll mark off the part of their property that would require mitigation, and they'd only build in the uplands. As far as the planning department's concerned, if you are coming in for a change to your entitlements, so a land use or a zoning change, we would definitely encourage you to build outside of any wetlands. And we would also recommend that if you have wetlands, that you put that in the conservation category. And many times, after you talk to the developers or talk to the applicants, they will do that, and that goes through city council and gets approved. And more conservation land, the more resilient we all are.
But if a developer, for instance, wants to build within the existing parameters, what land use rights are very strong in Florida. Property rights are really, have supremacy over almost all things. And this is a place where for decades now, there has been this thing called the Burt-Harris Act, where if the city or the state takes your property, and a taking is a broad definition now, meaning you're limited perhaps in what you can build. It might not be able to be this tall. It might not be able to be this dense. So if those determinations are made by a court that qualifies as a taking, then you have to reimburse the developer or pay some kind of, reimbursement for diverting their project or delaying their project.
Right. So if you already have your land use and zoning in place, you already have your entitlements. The city, the government is not going to take away those entitlements. So as long as you follow all the regulations and requirements that go with developing that property, you are proposing an allowed use. I mean, all this stuff would have to go through the city development review process. So you've got engineers, you've got housing officials, you've got everybody looking at your plans to make sure you meet all the requirements before you're even allowed to have that permit to move forward.
Right. But I mentioned it because your hands are tied in some ways. If a developer comes in to an area that perhaps 50 years ago, we weren't really thinking about flooding in the same way.
Right.
They've got essentially the right to build there. And it might be someplace that the city's resilience office now puts in red on the map. This could flood. You could be isolated. You could lose your utilities during a storm or after a storm. And there's not much the city can do when it comes to saying, no, you can't build there.
Correct. I mean, those are their property rights and they're entitled to them. We can't make any changes to that. There are certain things that we, might look to in the future to create further regulations or requirements. But right now there's a state bill in place that does not allow any more restrictive or burdensome regulations to be added to our code system. So all we can do right now is encourage and use the current system that's in place, our current regulations that are in place, until that requirement on the state level is removed.
And that's often called Senate Bill 180.
Correct.
That passed a couple years ago.
In 2025.
Okay. And so just specifically, what does that mean for cities and counties when it comes to your existing comprehensive plan? What does it mean can be done or can't be done?
Well, we can't make anything more burdensome. So basically, if there's anything that you want to do,
tighten up any
we
rules.
can't tighten up any regulations. We can't make anything harder on an individual than what the code currently says to move forward. Now, what we've proposed with the target growth area, that is an incentive program. It's an opt-in program. It doesn't change land use. It doesn't change zoning. You can go back to the way that things are right now, or you can opt into this incentive program. So we're not making things more burdensome or restrictive. It's an option to do this, and you as the property owner would choose that. So if you as the property owner choose that, then it's not, it would not fall under Senate Bill 180. But if we were to require certain design elements that are not already in the code or require affordable housing, we would not be able to do that until that state law is altered.
And there was some discussion this year at the legislative session about taking that language out. There's at least 20 counties that are suing over that language right now because they say they need to be able to update their comprehensive plan. It seems sort of like a no-brainer that as we move into an era of more intense storms and rising seas and a warming planet, that there would obviously need to be some changes made to how we develop. And that's currently not possible. But it does seem that there's this conflict because a lot of municipalities are just now starting to really recognize, see the signs of changing, climate, and beginning to really truly have to grapple with rainy day, flooding or sunny day flooding, I guess they call it, when tidal flood comes in. It seems like a very difficult point to put those restrictions on when it really is a time when a lot of government leaders are at best perhaps more motivated than they've ever been to try to put some restrictions in place.
Right. It has been an issue. We have held back on several things that we would like to move forward on that technically make things more restrictive.
What might those be?
Just if we wanted to remove an allowed use from a zoning code and maybe put it in a different area, like maybe move it from a light industrial use to a heavy industrial use. That could be like placing, which is something that we hear about all the time now, are data centers. Maybe we want to see that as a more restrictive use than a less restrictive use. So moving those types of things around, we wouldn't be able to do that. Maybe we want to increase the setbacks.
I want to ask you about the data center thing. I know that's not our primary focus here, but isn't the recent legislative session, the recent data community protection bill that was passed, doesn't that reinstate some flexibility for planners to allow communities to, develop specific restrictions for data centers in this period?
Right. I don't know the state bill backwards and forwards, but I do know that it sounds like a really good bill. It requires master plans for their water consumption, energy consumption, noise for the area. It requires a lot of different things as far as before you put a data center in place, all these things have to be checked off by the developer. I don't think it affects location. So that would be something on the local level. For the city of Jacksonville, it would have to be in a light industrial category. But because it's not a use that we have seen, it's not specifically listed in the code. And we can't do that without that Senate Bill 180 language removed. But it would have to be a light industrial use. So that's not necessarily a good example of how Senate Bill 180 affects things. But if we maybe wanted to, so if we allow less restrictive things, we can do that, and you'll see that type of legislation going forward. But as far as more restrictive would be, like I said, change to setbacks or requiring an additional restriction maybe for, I'm trying to think, like storage of trucks or anything like that. We can't make any changes until that's lifted. And it has a 2027 timeframe right now, unless there is an additional hurricane or unless they change it the next legislative session.
Yeah. Additional hurricane seems likely. I mean, to be honest. So one thing you've mentioned a couple of times is the fact that this would not affect single family zonings. And I want to ask about that because there was a previous controversy. It was called the missing middle proposal in 2024 that the city council was considering. What kind of pushback did that get? What did that teach you about what to do or not do this in developing this plan?
Well, the missing middle bill from last year was a much larger area. It wasn't a targeted approach. So this target growth area was based on about a year and a half of study with a committee filled with engineers, developers, land use attorneys, citizen planning advisory council members, planning commissioners. They also had all of city staff there. So you had the planning department there, the Office of Resilience, housing officials, the development services people. So this was an analysis completed to see what would work, what would best fit for a target growth area. So it was a deliberate approach to how things could work moving forward.
Because that previous plan could have allowed duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and existing single-family zonings, and
Right.
people really kind of freaked out about that.
Right. And so the missing middle bill was a larger area. I don't know exactly what those boundaries were based on. So there's that concern. And then also the community came out at that time because it did include low density residential areas, and they did not want a higher density maybe on a vacant lot that was next door to them.
In terms of the flood zones that the city is using, there's been some criticism that, existing FEMA maps aren't quite up to date. There's a website called First Street that offers more mapping that some people and reporters too use as a perhaps more realistic guide, what's going to flood in what circumstances, and more based on the current climate essentially, or projections of sea level rise, of more intense rainfall, those kinds of things. And I believe that, the maps that the city's using are still kind of FEMA based. Is there a sense that those are appropriately dramatic, for lack of a better word, in terms of what these areas are truly going to be facing when you're planning for areas that might be safe or safer from flooding?
Right. Well, the floodplains that we have right now are adopted into the comprehensive plan. So those would be the floodplains that we have to follow when approving and looking at any type of development. Those are the ones that are under the floodplain management ordinance. But as mentioned earlier, and again with this target growth area, we have the compound flood model spearheaded by the Office of Resilience. And that gives us way more details. We're actually very lucky to have that. It shows the combined impacts of coastal surge, tidal fluctuations, riverine flooding, and inland storm water flooding. It incorporates over 50,000 flood scenarios, and it shows the current conditions and future projections. It's really advanced data. While we can't use that right now, as far as for development purposes, we have to go by those FEMA floodplains. We can use this data in other areas. We can maybe use it for emergency preparation. The homeowner or developer can use this information to know what they're getting into, to know if they're going to flood or more likely to flood beyond the flood zone, so they can make those kind of changes of their development based on that if they so choose.
So what happens now with this proposal? What's the timetable, and what opportunities are there for people to get involved if they're interested in weighing in?
Okay, well, right now we're doing the comprehensive plan changes, and that gives the overarching idea and development of the target growth area. So that will incorporate the map that you showed earlier, and it will also incorporate the density increases that would be allowed should you opt into the incentive program. That goes first, and that's Ordinance 2026-311. And once that is approved by City Council, then it has to be reviewed by the state. And then when it comes back from the state, you'll see more of the details. So you'll see exactly what zoning flexibility you'll get through the zoning code, and you'll see exactly what type of resilient design factors you'd be required to do should you opt into the program. So that would be a separate ordinance. Overall, this is probably a 6 to 7 month period. Right now, we've been going out to the citizen planning advisory committees. We have been presenting to the Planning Commission, to the council members. I know there's been a significant outreach to some of the other community groups just to kind of let everybody know. We did that once in January, and we're doing it again now. This will be at the Planning Commission today, and then it will be at the Land Use and Zoning Committee of City Council on June 2nd. Both of those have
June 2nd.
June 2nd. Both of those have a public hearing, and the public can come speak. They can also reach out to the planning department or their city council members if they have an opinion and like to voice that. If you want more information, definitely come to the planning department and we can talk through in more detail any concerns that you have.
All right. Well, Helena Parola, she is the director of the planning department with the city of Jacksonville. Helena, thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
All right. Up next, we get a playlist from WJCT's own jazz guru and host of the show, Bop City. Welcome back. Galactic, Sheila E., Andra Day, Ghost Note. There are an array of superstars taking the stage over the coming days at the Jacksonville Jazz Fest 2026. Here to break down the lineup and help you plan your schedule is acclaimed saxophonist and host of WJCT 89.9's Saturday night jazz show, Bop City, Daniel Stark. Daniel, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here on the show and really excited for this lineup this year. I have to say, the city has really outdone themselves at bringing in acts who just span such an array of styles, from Nile Rodgers to Sheila E., Ghost Note, Jacksonville's own Beckett Miles, and John Lumpkin. There's such an amazing depth to the lineup this year, so I'm really blown away. I want to get the negatives out of the way first. It looks like it might rain, okay? And
Really?
It does. I was checking the forecast. It looks like about 50% chance on Saturday. You are allowed to bring umbrellas to Jazz Fest. So if you visit jacksonvillejazzfest.com/FAQ, they've got all the details there. Personal umbrellas up to 48 inches are allowed. No beach-style umbrellas, nothing that goes in the ground, but you can bring your own personal umbrella.
There's nothing wrong with a little rain, right? I mean, you can withstand that. We've had it at Jazz Fests in the past. It's not a deal breaker.
No, absolutely not. And I think the takeaway here is, someone like Nile Rodgers. I mean, this is somebody who is responsible for Good Times, for We Are Family, for I'm Coming Up, Diana Ross. I mean, the caliber of musicians that they have here is really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to see all these people come together.
So talk about this year's Jazz Fest relative to previous Jazz Fests. We were talking a little bit before the show about how excited you are that it's really back in the heart of downtown.
Oh, that's amazing. It shouldn't be in a parking lot. It should be on the grass. Me, I love the earth. I love plants. I love trees. I love the river. I love having a big playground for my kids. So Riverfront Plaza is a big step up from tailgaters. And you mentioned that the city really didn't have a choice because the landing project hadn't yet been developed into something where they could host these large-scale events. So, yeah, I'm really pleased.
Although they had it on the courthouse grounds,
okay,
right, at one
okay.
year. And so I guess they do have some flexibility. I mean, it doesn't have to be on Riverfront Plaza or at Bay on Ford where it is this year, but they chose last year to do it at the tailgate.
Yeah. Well, it's about the people, and Jazz Fest is for all the people of Jacksonville to come together and to show, this is a wonderful event for all the jazz community, for the musical community to really show up and support not just the touring artists, but also our local artists. Another thing that's going on this year is the Jazz Fest After Dark. So they've got some really great performers there. Someone I know locally, Pablo Duque, has a great band called Mr. Dinosaur.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be doing the Jazz Fest After Dark thing. They're a really cool group.
And remind us what Jazz Fest After Dark is. What does that encompass?
So that's smaller shows around Bay Street and the area where people can leave Jazz Fest and go and continue the party, bring it out into the city, and support all these establishments. Downtown has seen kind of a mixed track record of thriving and not thriving. So this is kind of an opportunity to really bring the jazz audience into those clubs. The jam session is another great thing, hosted by John Lumpkin, and you can see the jam session is really, to me as a performer, one of the highlights, because you never know who's going to get on stage with you. You might have Mono Neon on tour with Ghost Note, right? One of the most incredible bassists in the world right now, and he could decide, I want to go out to the jam session and hang with the cats playing in the club, right? Next thing you know, he's walking up behind me to play, his Mono Neon thing. You don't know what's going to happen, and that's really the beauty of jazz, and the jam session just embraces all that.
Let's just run through some of the headliners because I'm interested in, I mean, these are people that will draw people in. They're huge names, and some might say not all of them traditional jazz artists. So, in addition to the ones that you mentioned, Nile Rodgers and Chic, but Parliament Funkadelic with George Clinton, Esperanza Spalding, Kamasi Washington. We mentioned Andra Day, who was just on the closing show of the Stephen Colbert uh, show this week. So names that are really huge. Galactic, Ghost Note we mentioned too. What's on your must to do list?
I don't, I can't even narrow it down. They're all so amazing. And each of these people that you mentioned, yeah, jazz is a big house. It's got a lot of different styles. But look at Nile Rodgers, for example. His dad played with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra. One of the only black men to play with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra as an Afro-Cuban percussionist. And he came up in this environment of Lower East Side New York in the 60s, 70s, I'll say politely, a very bohemian environment. And the music that he comes out with is in response to that environment. It's the process of growing up and taking in all these different influences. And so when you hear Debbie Harry and you hear Nile Rodgers' influence on producing the B-52s and this whole generation of artists, right, that's coming directly out of the cultural lineage of jazz music, even though the outcome might not be like, dum, dum, da, doom, doom, da, doom, doom, da, doom. But jazz has always been about freedom and personal liberation. And people find that you can't really express that within the confines of the old music. And so they develop in new directions. Similarly with Sheila E., her father was a percussionist, Pete Escovedo. And a lot of her family became...
And her uncle is Alejandro Escovedo.
That's right. A lot of her family does punk rock and alternative rock music, but she was involved with Michael Jackson, Prince, as well as her own music.
Yeah.
And even
and she's a standing drummer, which is really bad.
That is really fantastic. And her godfather Tito Puente, I believe, was also a standing drummer.
You were talking about the drums' role in jazz a little bit with me before the program, and I'm interested if you kind of flesh that out because it was not something I'd heard before about the role of the drum kit.
Yeah, well, the drums before jazz music were not one instrument. The drums were a series of different instruments. And the tradition of jazz percussion really draws on two specific lineages. One is the Yoruba lineage that comes through Haiti and then Mexico, New Orleans, back to Jacksonville, or also direct from Haiti to Jacksonville, right? Because there's a lot of, and via, South Florida up to Jacksonville. And then there's the military tradition, which is, snare drums and things like that, and rudiments and all of that. So those are traditions of playing individual drums or two drums at a time with your hands. And it's really not until jazz music puts the bass drum on the floor and the hi-hat on a stand that it's physically possible to play the drums as a single instrument. And so all these folkloric rhythms and military rudiment rhythms become part of a single musician's training and learning to incorporate those into complex, polyrhythms and multi-rhythms that in the past have been played by a group. Now you've got to learn to do that as a single drummer. So that's really the central innovation of jazz is the formation of the small group with the drum kit as the percussion and rhythmic core, the bass as the harmonic underpinning, and the piano or guitar as the harmony to provide a backdrop for a melodic instrument, either vocals or a horn. And that format is the birth of rock and roll, the birth of soul, funk, disco, go-go. All of that comes out of jazz music, out of that innovation.
And that's partly why you see, Nile Rodgers, we keep coming back to, he was recently selected one of the top 30 living songwriters in the New York Times compilation. So he was along people like Taylor Swift, Lucinda Williams, chosen for his incredible skill set and the number of songs that have really penetrated the general consciousness. But he is often associated with disco. And so it's, for your thinking, it's kind of that drum, that rhythm that brings it into the jazz tradition?
Well, yeah, jazz is definitely based out of those rhythms. The underpinning of jazz is rhythmic. That's what defines jazz well, there's the heritage in blues and spirituals, the cultural legacy of that. And that also has a rhythmic basis to it because specifically the language of jazz is a rhythmic language. And that cultural tradition is conveyed through the language of drums. Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that you're not necessarily going to be able to pick and choose. I mean, the Jazz Fest gets rolling today essentially with the piano competition, and that's always, a wonderful thing to see. The winner of that gets to perform on the main stage. But then the next 3 days that follow are going to be filled with these headliners. The main stage on Bay Street at Ford on Bay, which is already all set up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes, they're all going to be incredible, and everybody who goes is going to be left with this incredible buzz in their minds of how amazing jazz music is, how amazing this culture is, and how important it is to support that culture. And so I think the next step is to say, well, how do we make that happen all year, right? And for those of us who are working on jazz, not just Memorial Day weekend, but June, July, August, September, look at some of the nonprofits in town, Don't Miss a Beat, and jams, and the people who are really working to build an infrastructure to support jazz music year round, right? And one of the kind of thought questions that I would ask is like, let's flip the equation. And let's say that what if instead of having one weekend of jazz festival, we had a jazz orchestra, a jazz symphony orchestra, where people could make a living wage, have retirement income, have health insurance to perform in a jazz orchestra in a $300 million building downtown. And we had one weekend a year for a classical music festival, right? When touring musicians from out of town came to perform for a giant crowd of people, right? What would that look like psychologically to our minds? And as a thought experiment, I think that really helps us to probe how, as a culture, how we think of jazz music and what we really value and prize and how we can continue to provide for the future of that music and the future of these musicians in a really meaningful way.
That's a fascinating thought experiment. And so what specific things would you like to see happen between the Memorial Day weekends in this city in terms of clubs, fans, musicians, opportunities?
Well, I mean, I think one thing you could talk about is if you want to sponsor the Jazz Fest, you've got to host X number of performances throughout the year featuring local performers, Oh. And if you want to be the sponsoring hotel of Jazz Fest, you're going to have your name out there in conjunction with this incredible cultural tradition. You got to put your business on the line and support this thing year round, right? And, I think that there's also an important question to ask, which is, okay, for the festival writ large, and you look at where the dollars go and what the festival is designed to support, right? Hotel income, tourist tax dollars, DIA, right? Where does all that fit into the local cultural community? And where are cultural producers left, right? Is that a trickle-down theory? Are we supposed to wait for these tax dollars to just make gigs for us? Or is there some kind of more sustainable infrastructure, maybe through the existing nonprofits, like I mentioned, Jams and Don't Miss a Beat, the John Lumpkin Institute, who are active year-round in providing a platform for up-and-coming jazz musicians? But where do those jazz musicians go, right? Where is the professional infrastructure? Jacksonville University is gone.
With its program.
University of North Florida has a very small number of faculty spots that are typically not held by, up and coming representatives of historic jazz culture, to put it politely.
Great conversation, Daniel Stark. Thank you for coming in, sharing your thoughts, talking about Jazz Festival, which of course gets underway today.
That's right. Jazz Fest is for the people, so everybody should go. We've got to show up, we've got to show out, and just have a good time.
All right, Daniel Stark, thanks for being here. Up next, there is news worth celebrating when it comes to the right whale. We'll tell you about an upcoming art show that does just that.
Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. When people are hurt through no fault of their own, finding the who, what, when, where, why, and how that led to the accident is critical to proving the truth.
More at TerrellHoganLaw.com. Tidbits, family owned and operated since 1985. 4 locations, Bay Meadows, Hendricks, Mandarin, and now Fleming Island. Menu items include fresh sandwiches, salads, and soups. Open Monday through Saturday. Online ordering and menu at clarastidbits.com.
WJCT Film presents Singin' in the Rain, one of the greatest movie musicals ever made. A film preserved in the Library of Congress, celebrated around the world, and ranked among the top 10 films of all time. Singin' in the Rain, starring Gene Kelly, Debbie Reynolds, and Donald O'Connor. Unforgettable songs, dazzling choreography, and the iconic moment in the rain. WJCT Film presents a true Hollywood classic in glorious Technicolor Wednesday, June 10th, doors open at 6:30, film at 7. WJCT.org/film.
We are facing the biggest energy security threat in the history.
Europe and Asia are facing fuel shortages. The U.S. is in a fuel deficit, and now growing numbers of industry observers say an historic oil shock is coming for the world economy, and it could hit the U.S. right around the 4th of July. That's on the next On Point.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Test scores show that most K-12 students around the country are struggling with reading and math. Researchers call it the learning recession. It's been going on for a decade. Some states and school districts are making changes and seeing scores rise. We'll explore how next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Right whales are headed back north after a successful calving season in offshore Florida and Georgia. And a photo exhibit celebrating the endangered mammal is also in transit. The Right Whales of Amelia Island exhibit is on display now at the Beaches Museum. It's there through August. And here to tell us about it is Chrissy Barr with the Amelia Island Whale Ambassadors. Chrissy, good morning.
Good morning.
So this is a pretty good year for a species that's in a pretty tough spot. Tell us what happened in terms of the calving season and how that figures into the overall threats to this endangered species.
Well, first of all, we have less than 400 North Atlantic right whales left. And usually we have somewhere under 15 or so baby calves that happen every year. This year we had 23 calves, and that was the best we've had since 2009. But we need 50 calves a year to turn around the path to extinction. So while we're super happy that we've had the most number since 2009, we still need to have more calves.
Yeah. And so what is the main danger? What is the primary threat to these whales? Why are they so endangered?
There are two big threats to them. First, entanglements. Picture, if you would, swimming through a forest of fishing lines coming down. The whale gets entangled. And when it gets entangled, it rolls around and try to get out of it, and it gets more and more entangled. 85% of North Atlantic right whales have been entangled. The second are vessel strikes, and that's a serious issue because right now there are entities that are trying to get rid of the vessel speed rule, and we know that more deaths happen when boats are going faster when the right whales are here.
There are currently a number of rollbacks proposed to existing protections, including the 1972 Marine Mammal Protection Act, the 1973 Endangered Species Act. You mentioned the vessel speed rule. Tell us what's happening. Why are there pressures to change some of these? Who is on each side?
Well, I wish I could answer that question politely. I can't. The current administration is backing business, and I'm a business backer myself. But we can do things smart. We don't have to hurt the fishermen. We have on-demand fishing technologies that are here now, and we can incentivize fishermen to use that. We can practice safe boating. There's no reason that just for a few months of the year, we're talking here in the Jacksonville area, between mid-November to mid-April, slow down when there's a right whale around, when they're here and we know that. I wish I could answer that question. These beautiful mammals that are bigger than school buses are hard to see because they don't have a dorsal fin and they're black. And I don't understand why people would want to see them go extinct. And more importantly, we need the right whales. When the right whales poop, probably didn't think I was going to talk about poop today, but when they poop.
Oh, I knew it. No, I'm just kidding.
The phytoplankton eat the poop. Now, why are the phytoplankton important? They take out 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that humans make out of the atmosphere, and they release oxygen back into the atmosphere. So every other breath you take, think of phytoplankton. So if we don't have whale poops, we don't have phytoplankton.
Yeah. And so this exhibit that's traveling around now is a way to showcase the species. As we mentioned, it's a traveling exhibit. It's going to end up in Clearwater, I think.
Yes, it goes to Clearwater next.
What does it show if people go to the exhibit? What are they going to see? And why do you think these images are important for people to look at?
Well, first of all, the exhibit at Beaches started in Amelia Island, and I personally worked on it with a wonderful team of people. It took us about a year to pull it together. Why it's important for people to see it is because it tells the story of the North Atlantic right whale. It talks about their calving. It talks about why they're hard to see. It talks about the hope that we can have from vessel speed rules staying intact and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. It talks about entanglements and new ways to fish. So if you really want to educate yourself about this magnificent species, go to Beaches and see the exhibit. It's beautiful.
Yeah. And you brought a little critter with you. Tell us about this stuffed animal that is behind you.
Well, it's my favorite stuffy. It is a right whale, and I like to show people that it's hard to see because they don't have that dorsal fin. Each right whale, you see the white spots on it, has their own fingerprints, so to say, of these callosities. So we can tell what right whales are what. And one of the fun thing is,
what's a callosity?
It's the white spots on the right whale.
And they're made of is it just part of their skin?
It's their unique fingerprint that they have.
Uh-huh.
So, and they always have that. So we can tell that Millipede and her calf are here. And last year we saw them frolicking off the coast of Amelia Island. Then they saw them in the Gulf. And then they saw them back up in Cape Cod. So we know that they travel and we can follow them based on their callosities. That's how we know who they are.
And so these are all named whales,
They
the ones that are in the portraits are identifiable as such.
Absolutely. So we know who they are, and it's fun to see, Millipede or Ghost. Ghost is a 50-year-old whale that just had her 9th calf. So, and I wonder how many 50-year-olds are having their 9th baby.
And there's
right
one named
now.
Champagne.
There's one named Champagne. That was the first one this year. And of course, the Amelia Island Whale Ambassadors celebrated with Champagne. But you don't have to be an Amelia Island Whale Ambassador to come up. We had people from Jacksonville come up and watch her and celebrate with us as well.
Well, the Right Whales of Amelia Island exhibit is at the Beaches Museum in Jacksonville Beach. It's up now. It runs through August 23rd. Chrissy Barr, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you for caring about the right whales.
All right. And thank you for listening. First Coast Connect is produced by Stacey Bennett. Our associate producer is Isabella Casapow. Our show is directed by Brady Corum, and our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we discuss the week's top headlines, from an NAACP call for a college athlete boycott of the state to a fresh round of subpoenas into a spiraling investigation sparked by the council president. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com.
Wolfson Children's Hospital, where generations of families have found hope. Because it's here at Wolfson Children's where answers are found, odds are beaten, and comebacks begin every day. Wolfson Children's, always here. Visit wolfsonchildrens.com.